Once again, the queen consort has surprised everyone, but not in a positive way. Made shocking and untrue claims about the royal family, feeding into her fears and deepening her sense of paranoia. The silence inside Windsor was not broken by raised voices. It was broken by a seal. William stood before a locked file marked with the late Queen's private insignia, and when the final decree was opened, everything in the room changed. Camilla's name was there. Diana's name was there. And between them was a single sentence so devastating that even Charles could no longer act as though the monarchy had been prepared for it. Before we dive further into what this truly means for the royal family, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an update. William did not hurry the moment. He held the document with the steady composure of a man who knew that one sentence could wound more deeply than any public controversy. The final decree, the Queen's last written royal instruction intended to be carried out after her passing, had been sealed under her private authority. It declared in clear and unforgiving terms that Camilla was forbidden from accessing Diana's private vault, and that all future authority over that vault would remain under William's protection. The prince lowered his eyes to the page once more, almost as though reading it again might somehow soften the words. Didn't. Charles felt the impact before anyone said a word. The king sat nearby, his expression tightened by a pain that could not be hidden behind royal protocol. This was never just about a locked chamber or a forgotten collection. Within the family, Diana's vault had long been understood as a protected space containing private belongings, letters, personal jewelry, and memories connected to the woman whose presence had never truly disappeared from the monarchy. For Charles, the decree reopened the oldest wound within his family. For William, it placed that wound directly into his care. Camilla received the decision in complete stillness, though it was far from peaceful. The queen consort had expected resistance, perhaps a delay, perhaps another quiet compromise inside the palace. But this was different. Her request had not been refused by an aide, a committee, or a cautious advisor. It had been denied by the queen herself in writing, backed by the full authority of her final royal instruction. Camilla's expression shifted only slightly, but everyone in the room felt it. Her hope of gaining access had not been delayed. It had been brought to an end. The outer door closed with a quiet, deliberate click. A senior aide stepped back, making it clear that no courtier would carry this discussion into the corridors until the family had fully absorbed what had happened. William's hand paused over the lower section of the file. There was more. Beneath the first decree rested a second sealed instruction, marked for future authority over the vault. The prince looked toward Charles, then toward Camilla, and realized that the most painful sentence had not yet been spoken. Every royal crisis has its document, but this one also had faces. William saw his mother in every line. Charles saw the past he had spent decades trying to outlive. Camilla saw a boundary drawn by a woman who was no longer alive to explain it. And Catherine, standing just beyond the center of power, understood that this was more than a family decision. It was an old wound reopened by royal authority. William kept his eyes fixed on the page, yet everyone present knew he was seeing far more than ink. Diana's vault was never simply a private storage place for royal possessions. It was a protected collection of personal letters, jewelry, records, and treasured items connected to his mother's life, kept away from public view because they carried sorrow as much as history. The prince understood why the queen had chosen to issue a final decree, a written command designed to outlive her. She had never wanted this matter left to emotion, pressure, or palace convenience. Charles shifted in his seat first, and that small movement revealed more pain than any speech ever could. The king had a duty to honor the queen's instruction. Yet Camilla sat beside him, wounded by that very command. He wanted to soften its meaning. He wanted to suggest that the decree was about procedure rather than rejection. But William refused to let the words lose their force. The prince stated that the language was unmistakably clear, and everyone in the room felt the line between duty and denial grow even stronger. Camilla looked toward William as though hoping for a private act of mercy. The Queen Consort already understood the damage before anyone outside Windsor heard a single word. A refusal from the late monarch was never an ordinary no. It was a permanent decision, sealed by royal authority, witnessed by trusted officials, and protected from casual reconsideration. She quietly asked whether the decision could ever be reviewed, whether time or changing circumstances might lessen its authority. William answered with care but without hesitation. The decree was final. It had been witnessed, had been sealed, and no one in that room had the authority to rewrite the Queen's final command. Catherine watched him choose restraint when anger would have been the easier path. She saw the tension in his jaw, the old pain hidden beneath his calm voice, and the immense discipline it took not to speak from hurt. Her presence steadied him without taking the moment away from him. Charles noticed it as well, making the situation even more difficult. The monarchy was not simply witnessing a son defend his mother's memory. It was watching a future king learn how to carry grief without allowing it to consume the room. Then Catherine's attention returned to the file. William had not yet mentioned the second sealed instruction. He had read the first devastating decree aloud. But another folded page still remained untouched. Another command waiting beneath the silence. Camilla noticed his hesitation. Charles saw it as well. And as those gathered in the room struggled to grasp what the decree truly meant, an older memory began to surface. A hidden incident that had led the Queen to write it in the first place. The decree had not appeared out of nowhere. It had been born from one unforgettable evening at Balmoral, when a private conversation became a lasting royal divide. The Queen had listened in silence that night, speaking very little as Diana's name passed through the room like a warning. But those who had been present later understood what had really happened. That was the night the monarch stopped believing silence could protect the memory of the dead. William remembered the evening with painful clarity. The Balmoral Memorial Dinner incident, as it later came to be known within the household, was a private family dinner during which Camilla asked whether several items from Diana's vault could be reviewed for a possible historic royal exhibition. A royal exhibition meant placing private belongings into a carefully curated palace display so the public could view them as part of the monarchy's history. But to the prince, those items were never exhibition pieces. They were his mother's life, her letters, her jewelry, and the private remains of a woman the world had already taken far too much from. Camilla had spoken carefully that evening. But careful words did not make the request any less painful. The Queen Consort insisted that history should be handled properly, not emotionally. She argued that Diana's place within the monarchy deserved to be preserved with dignity, not hidden away behind locked doors. William heard something entirely different. He heard his mother's memory being shifted from private grief into public control. The prince pushed his chair back just enough for everyone in the room to notice. Then he asked why Diana's personal belongings were being discussed without his approval. Charles attempted to calm the situation, but his voice only deepened the divide. The king wanted peace. Yet peace required someone to leave disappointed, and he could not bring himself to firmly stand with either side. He looked toward Camilla, then toward William, and that hesitation said everything. The prince noticed it. The queen noticed it. Even Camilla understood that Charles was standing in the middle of a wound he could not heal. His silence became an answer all on its own. The Queen watched William's expression change. And in that moment, the monarch recognized the danger. Diana's memory was not merely ceremonial. It remained a living source of pain for her son. A private secretary, meaning the trusted official responsible for handling the monarch's most sensitive written instructions, was summoned later that evening. The Queen never raised her voice. She dictated the first wording of the decree with calm precision, making the restriction on the vault personal, permanent, and impossible to soften in the future. Camilla believed the dinner had ended with discomfort, not consequences. William believed the matter had been left behind. Charles hoped time would dull the pain. But the Queen had already made her decision. Her final wording named William as the future guardian because she believed he would protect Diana's memory without allowing grief to become revenge. That single dinner became the hidden beginning of everything. And now, years later, the prince found himself facing the woman whose request had prompted the monarch's final barrier. Camilla did not lose her composure in front of the household. She waited until the door had closed. Then the queen consort turned toward William with an expression carrying years of restraint, resentment, and disbelief. The future king did not move. Charles stood between them like a man caught between the past and the future. Inside that private room, the decree became more than a document. It became a confrontation. William remained where he was, as though every breath had to be measured. The private sitting room at Windsor held no junior aides, no quiet voices from the hallway, and no one who could interrupt what was about to unfold. A decree, a formal written order carrying royal authority, had already spoken on the Queen's behalf. But Camilla wanted to hear the answer directly from William. She asked whether he truly intended to enforce the command exactly as it had been written. The prince replied calmly that he had no authority to ignore the monarch's final instruction. Camilla's expression hardened at his response. She argued that Diana's vault belonged to royal history, and that royal property could not remain governed by grief forever. William's composure nearly gave way. The vault, he reminded her, was not an exhibition hall, not a trophy room, not a place the palace could draw from whenever it needed emotional symbolism. It held his mother's private life. It held pieces of a woman who had been watched, used, loved, and broken before the entire world. And this time, he would not allow her memory to be treated as decoration. Charles stepped forward, desperate to calm the room before words were spoken that could never be taken back. The king tried to suggest that the decree required careful interpretation. But Camilla turned toward him before he could finish. She asked whether he had known that her name was specifically included in the restriction. Charles did not answer quickly enough. That brief silence hurt her more than any direct admission could have. She looked at him as though his hesitation had confirmed her greatest fear. The Queen had not written a general rule. She had drawn a boundary around Camilla herself. Catherine stepped quietly closer to William without saying a word. She did not need to speak in his defense. Her presence alone was enough. The princess understood that he was standing in the middle of a family storm, trying to protect Diana without humiliating Camilla, trying to honor the Queen without breaking Charles. And William could feel that quiet support beside him. It gave him the steadiness he needed when giving in to anger would have been far easier. It reminded him that power without restraint could destroy the very memory he was trying to protect. Camilla's shock quickly turned sharper when William explained the full reach of the order. The decree did not simply deny her personal access. It also prevented palace staff from granting entry on her behalf, meaning no aide, archivist, or royal official could quietly unlock the vault under another name. Camilla looked at him in disbelief, stunned by how thoroughly the Queen had sealed every possible path. Then the prince spoke one final word that changed the atmosphere in the room. Review. Any effort to override the decree would trigger a formal review of all previous access requests. The moment he said it, the confrontation shifted from wounded emotions to royal authority. Because someone within the palace had already attempted to work around the Queen's command. Power inside the monarchy is rarely loud. Sometimes it is nothing more than a key held by the wrong person. Sometimes it is a signature placed in the wrong ledger. As William traced the decree's chain of authority, everyone in the room began to understand why the Queen had been so exact. She had not written the order out of suspicion alone. She had written it because she feared the vault could be opened through pressure disguised as protocol. William requested the access record, and the room grew tense before it even arrived. The decree had granted him direct guardianship over Diana's vault, meaning he alone possessed final authority over who could enter, inspect, move, or approve anything connected to that protected collection. Catherine had been appointed as a supporting witness for any future ceremonial review. That meant she would stand beside him if the palace ever attempted to use Diana's belongings for an official public display. That detail mattered. It showed that the queen had not placed her trust in a single signature. She had built a safeguard with witnesses. The senior archivist entered carrying the old ledger tightly against his chest. An archivist is the official responsible for protecting royal records, private collections, and access logs. And this one fully understood the weight of what he was carrying. He avoided looking at Camilla as he carefully placed the ledger in front of William. His hands remained steady. But the fear was impossible to hide. The book was more than a simple record. It was proof of who had asked, who had signed, and who had tried to reach Diana's memory through official channels. William slowly turned the pages until one entry stopped him completely. A recent internal request had been submitted to catalog selected items from the vault for heritage review. The wording appeared harmless, almost routine. But the prince understood exactly how palace language worked. Catalog meant inspect. Heritage review meant possible public display. Selected items meant someone already knew exactly what they wanted. His quiet determination became even stronger because the request no longer felt like preservation. It felt like access disguised as ceremony. Charles noticed the same entry and quietly removed his glasses, placing them on the table without a word. The king looked embarrassed, not because he had been exposed, but because the machinery of the palace had once again transformed private grief into managed procedure. He understood why it mattered. If Diana's vault could be opened through carefully chosen wording, then the Queen's decree could be weakened without anyone openly violating it. If family trust could be bypassed by paperwork, then William's authority meant very little. Camilla denied requesting anything improper. The Queen Consort insisted she had never instructed anyone to work around the decree. Charles looked toward her as though he desperately wanted to believe every word she said. But the memory of the earlier Balmoral request now stood in the room once again, heavier than ever. William made no accusation. Catherine remained silent. Even so, Camilla could feel suspicion settling around her because the language in the ledger echoed too closely the argument she had once made herself. Catherine noticed it before anyone else. One page in the copied ledger did not look right. The numbering skipped. The sequence was broken. She leaned in slightly, then met William's eyes with a calm expression that carried its own warning. Page was missing. Someone had removed it in an attempt to erase part of the record. The missing page accomplished what raised voices never could. It made the consequences immediate. And it forced the family to accept that the Queen's decree had already been challenged. By nightfall, Windsor was no longer peaceful. Phones had been silenced. Staff assignments had changed. A private archive corridor was secured under new authority. And Camilla, who had begun the day expecting negotiation, found herself confronting an entirely different reality. The late Queen's final word had become a wall. And William now stood before it with no intention of stepping aside. William gave the order without raising his voice. The vault access system was to be frozen until the missing ledger page had been recovered and every previous request thoroughly examined. An access system refers to the official process used to authorize entry, record names, and monitor movement around protected royal collections. That mattered because Diana's private vault was no longer just a room preserving memories. It had become a test of whether the Queen's final command could truly withstand pressure from within her own family. Camilla sat alone after the meeting, stunned in a way that anger could not conceal. The Queen Consort had expected another familiar royal compromise, the kind where painful decisions were softened and everyone left with something. Instead, she had been informed that no staff member, no archivist, and no palace official could move, photograph, catalog, or publicly display anything connected to Diana without William's written authorization. The door closed behind her, and the sound felt unmistakably final. In a single day, her influence over that part of royal history had come to an end. Charles went to see her in private, but comfort did not come easily. The king wanted to tell Camilla that the matter could still be managed, that the palace might still find a gentler way forward. Yet he knew the decree was both legally unshakable and emotionally impossible to ignore. It carried the Queen's authority. and it carried Diana's pain. Charles sat beside Camilla, choosing each word with care, but she recognized his hesitation. He could sympathize with her, but he could not undo what his mother had written. Catherine found William in the corridor, and her quiet composure cut through the weight surrounding him. She gently told him that protecting Diana's memory must never become an act of public cruelty. The princess understood why the vault mattered. She understood why the missing page had changed everything. But she also knew that grief, once given too much power, could become dangerous. William listened because Catherine was not asking him to step away. She was asking him to remain compassionate while standing his ground. Whispers spread quickly throughout the household. Aides quietly remarked that the Queen had anticipated this very crisis because the decree had closed every possible loophole before anyone could exploit one. William's name now carried the full responsibility of enforcing the order. Camilla's name carried the pain of being excluded. Charles carried both burdens and had no way to set either one aside. The immediate consequence was harsh in its simplicity. Camilla no longer held any influence over Diana-related royal memory. Not directly, not indirectly, not through palace staff. And as the restrictions surrounding the vault grew even tighter, William faced the more difficult question Catherine had placed before him. How could he protect his mother's memory without allowing pain to control him? The turning point did not take place inside a council room. It happened in a smaller chamber, away from aides, away from protocol, and away from the royal machinery that had made everyone harder than they wished to be. At last, William and Charles stood alone. For once, there was no crown standing between them, only a son, father, and the memory of a woman neither of them had ever truly escaped. William entered first, carrying the silence of the day with him. Charles followed more slowly, looking noticeably older than he had only hours before. A council room was where official royal decisions were debated. But this was something entirely different. This was private, stripped of titles, stripped of witnesses, stripped of every carefully chosen phrase that had protected them for years. The prince had not come to accuse his father. He had come because Catherine's words still echoed in his mind. Protect Diana, but do not let pain rule you. Charles spoke before William had the chance. He admitted that the decree hurt because it revealed how unfinished the past remained within the family. The king said the queen had done more than protect a vault. She had exposed the part of the monarchy that still could not hear Diana's name without tension filling the room. William listened, and for the first time he did not interrupt. He understood that Charles was not defending Camilla in that moment. He was confronting the cost of a life that had left too many hearts carrying different versions of the same wound. William answered with a calm that made every word feel even heavier. He told Charles that the decision was never about punishing Camilla. It was about honoring the Queen's final boundary and protecting Diana's private dignity. The prince said his mother had already given enough of herself to the public. Enough to the palace. Enough to history. Whatever remained behind that vault door had to remain untouched unless it served truth rather than image. Charles lowered his eyes when William spoke Diana's name. Not with anger. Not with resentment. Only with grief. The king's emotions became impossible to hide, and the atmosphere between them shifted. Charles had expected resistance. Perhaps blame. Perhaps the old pain returning with renewed force. Instead, William offered restraint. The prince explained that the missing ledger page would never be used as a weapon against Camilla unless clear evidence of misconduct was found. He would not allow suspicion to become punishment. He would not allow grief to become revenge. Charles heard the difference. And for the first time that day, he seemed to truly recognize the man standing before him. William waited for his father's response. Last, Charles gave it. The king accepted that the vault had to remain protected. He agreed not to challenge the decree, not to ask for softer wording, and not to pressure William into turning the Queen's final command into another palace compromise. That acceptance did not heal everything. It did not erase Camilla's pain. It did not remove Diana's shadow, but it gave the crisis a new direction. The turning point was not a victory. It was restraint. William would enforce the Queen's command firmly, but without public humiliation. Charles would carry the sorrow of that decision, but he would no longer fight against it. That restraint reshaped the crisis. But beyond the palace walls, events were already moving faster. By the following morning, the secret had escaped. Britain awoke to a royal story that felt less like gossip and more like history demanding attention. One headline carried the weight of a verdict. One photograph carried the sorrow of an entire generation. And as crowds gathered outside the palace gates, Diana's name returned to the center of the monarchy with a force no one could stop. William saw the front page before the palace had even approved its first official response. The headline was devastating. The Queen's final barrier. Camilla barred from Diana's vault. Beside the headline was a split image of the prince and the late princess, transforming a private family decree into a national moment of reflection. A newspaper's front page matters because it does more than report an event. It fixes that moment in the public's memory. William understood that immediately, and the weight of it unsettled him. He had wanted protection, not spectacle. Camilla followed the coverage from a private room, and every headline seemed to tighten around her name. The Queen Consort had been denied access behind closed doors. But now the nation was reading it as rejection, judgment, and history all at once. One broadcaster described the decree as the most emotionally significant royal order of the modern reign. That phrase quickly spread everywhere. A royal order is an official command backed by the authority of the crown. For Camilla, that made the humiliation even deeper because this was no longer being viewed as a private family disagreement. It was being treated as royal law. Crowds gathered outside Kensington Palace before midday. Some carried white roses, placing them gently near the gates as though Diana's memory had suddenly returned to the forefront. The gesture was quiet, yet it spoke louder than any television debate. People were not simply reacting to Camilla being denied access. They were responding to the idea that the Queen had drawn one final line around Diana's private life. That mattered because it gave the public a simple emotional truth. Even after all these years, some parts of Diana still deserved to be protected. Catherine urged restraint as the palace communications team began drafting its official statement. She reminded William that the response needed to protect dignity rather than deepen division. The princess understood that one poorly chosen sentence could turn Camilla into a target, and William into a weapon. The prince listened, still troubled by the newspaper headline, still aware that his mother's name could inspire love and anger in equal measure. Catherine's calm mattered because she understood both sides of public emotion. Sympathy could quickly become cruelty if the palace handled the moment poorly. Charles approved the final statement with a heavy heart. The king allowed the palace to confirm that Diana's private collection would remain protected under established royal authority. But he refused to let the statement become an attack on Camilla. William accepted that decision. Camilla remained deeply hurt by it. Catherine watched the carefully chosen words land exactly as they were meant to. Firm, measured, final. And when the public noise eventually began to fade, the monarchy was left with the only question that truly mattered. Not who had won, but what the decree had revealed. In the end, the decree did not damage the monarchy. It revealed it. It showed where grief still remained, where loyalty still mattered, and where the past could no longer be reshaped for comfort. William had opened a sealed command. But what he truly uncovered was a truth the family had avoided for years. Diana's memory was never a room to be entered. It was a boundary that deserved respect. William completed the final enforcement with a steadiness that carried more weight than victory ever could. The formal order was placed before him. The prince signed it without celebration. An enforcement order is the written step that transforms a royal command into active palace policy, ensuring that staff, officials, and family members are required to follow it. That mattered because the Queen's decree could no longer be dismissed as a painful private wish. It had become the rule protecting Diana's vault from pressure, uncertainty, and quiet negotiation. Charles watched William's signature settle onto the page and accepted everything it represented. The king wore visible sadness because honoring his mother's command also meant acknowledging the limits of his own authority. He could not soften the decree for Camilla. He could not rewrite the queen's final boundary for the sake of comfort. Charles realized the monarchy had reached a moment where duty demanded sacrifice. He had spent years trying to hold the past together. But this time, the past had answered through his mother's own hand. Camilla was never publicly attacked. William made certain of that. The queen consort's access was permanently denied. But the prince refused to turn the decision into public humiliation. Her role in matters connected to Diana's royal legacy was permanently restricted. Yet her name was never dragged through a public trial. That restraint mattered because it showed William was not acting as a wounded son seeking revenge. He was acting as a future king learning that power becomes dangerous when it is driven by anger. Catherine stood beside him as the final documents were carefully put away. The princess did not appear triumphant, nor did she need to speak. Her quiet support carried the true meaning of the day. Diana's dignity had been protected, but no one in that room had truly won. The missing ledger page had been recovered and sealed into the review file, bringing the immediate crisis to an end without turning it into another palace conflict. The danger had been contained. The lesson remained. At last, William closed the file. The silence that followed felt very different from the silence that had begun it all. The Queen's final decree had protected Diana's private dignity. It had pushed the prince toward mature leadership. And it had forced Charles to face the cost of unresolved history. Camilla left with a boundary she could never cross. Catherine remained beside a man who had chosen restraint over anger. The monarchy emerged bruised, yet steadier, because this time it chose memory over image, duty over comfort, and silence over spectacle. There was no mystery left to pursue. Only William closing the file, not as a wounded son seeking revenge, but as a future king choosing protection, restraint, and duty. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.